Milei has suffered a resounding defeat just weeks before the most important elections for his political plan.
Hay que ser claro es que, sin ninguna dudas, en el plano político, hoy hemos tenido una clara derrota. Y si alguien quiere empezar a reconstruir y salir adelante, lo primero que hay que aceptar son los resultados. Y hoy los resultados no han sido positivos y hemos tenido un revés electoral y hay que aceptarlo.
Argentina has been shaken. On September 7th, provincial elections were held in Buenos Aires, the first major political test for Javier Milei's project. In these elections, 46 seats in the Buenos Aires Chamber of Deputies and 23 in the provincial state were up for renewal. And don't forget that we're talking about the largest province in the country by far. Almost 40% of the entire Argentine population lives here. Well, the result has surprised everyone, and not exactly for the better. The reality turned out to be worse than even the worst predictions for the Libertarian Lions Party.
Overwhelming victory for the Justicialist Party in the province of Buenos Aires. It beat La Libertad Avanza by more than 13 points.
The Peronists in the province of Buenos Aires, led by Axel Kicillof, have beaten Milei's party by more than 13 points. We're talking about 47.3% of the votes for the Peronists, compared to only 33.7% for the Libertarian and Macri bloc. Axel Kicillof's party won in 6 of the 8 electoral districts, including the 2 most populated ones. In fact, in the first electoral district, in the very heart of the Buenos Aires suburbs, the unexpected happened. Peronist Gabriel Catapodis, a Kicillof supporter, took a 10-point lead over Libertarian candidate Diego Valenzuela. 10 points. The Peronists even managed to improve on their own results from the previous elections by more than 2 points. In other words, this is a blow to the president, to the reformist agenda, and to a party led by his sister, Karina Milei. And naturally, this will have consequences. Consequences on many levels, which we'll discuss shortly in this video. I'm sure that right now, many of you are wondering, how on earth could the defeat have been so severe? What consequences could the result of these elections have? How could all this affect market confidence? Are we witnessing the collapse of Javier Milei's project? Well, here on VisualPolitik, we've also been working on these questions, so let's answer them all. Listen up. Before we dive in, let me ask you, how often do you actually feel safe online? Because here's the truth, going incognito doesn't really make you invisible. Your internet provider, your workplace, even your home Wi-Fi router, all of them can still track everything you do. That's where CyberGhost VPN comes in, the sponsor of today's video. And it's not just any VPN. CyberGhost is one of the most trusted VPNs out there, with over 38 million users worldwide and more than 20,000 glowing reviews on Trustpilot. It hides your IP address and encrypts your data, so your browsing stays solely your business. Even CyberGhost doesn't keep logs of what you're doing. It's super easy to use. Just pick a location, they have over 100 available, turn it on, and you're protected. You can even unlock content that's not available in your country from over 40 platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+. Traveling or working remotely, CyberGhost also helps you avoid sketchy public Wi-Fi risks, and even score better deals online by changing your virtual location. It works on pretty much everything: phones, laptops, tablets, even your smart TV and console. And one subscription covers up to 7 devices, so it's perfect for sharing. The best part, right now with the link in the description, you'll get a whopping 84% off, just $2.03 a month, and 4 extra months free. It's risk-free too, with a 45-day money-back guarantee, so there's nothing to lose. Go ahead, protect your digital life. Click the link, try CyberGhost, and stay one step ahead online. In order to understand what may have happened, we need to look not only at politics, but at 3 different fronts: the economy, the political game itself, and communication. But let's start with the first one. Milei came to power promising to blow up the status quo and end inflation, and in part, that is being achieved. Prices have stopped rising at the uncontrolled rate of 2023, and year-on-year inflation could close 2025 at around 30%. A crazy level by global standards, yes, but nothing like it was in 2023. The problem, and this is perhaps what many in La Libertad Avanza have failed to understand, is that the voters who trusted Milei understood that there would be a cost, but not all of them imagined how painful it would be. Let me explain. Milei is not a guy who's deceived anyone on this issue. When he ran for election, election. The president said time and again that the adjustment would be radical and painful. There would be a period of stagnation, a possible recession, and an economy that would have to suffer the consequences of weaning itself off the monetary drug in order to heal. Many Argentines understood this, but the problem is that not everyone was prepared to deal with it. Because even though macroeconomic data has shown clear signs of improvement, the perception in the small-scale economy, in businesses, and in families always lags behind. This is what is known as the lag effect, and it's one of the most difficult issues that a reformist politician has to deal with when implementing major changes, and even more so in a context as complicated as Argentina's. Well, this lag effect exists in Argentina, and it's not giving the government any respite. Many people, especially in the depressed areas of the Buenos Aires suburbs, feel that Milei's economic measures have so far only been felt in terms of improved inflation. But there have been no clear improvements in their living conditions, especially in the many cases of families who are living on subsidies and have now lost them or seen them severely cut. This is one of the problems with the policy of giving out handouts left and right. It creates a dependency that is very difficult to deal with later on, when families become accustomed to assistance, whether it be direct transfers or subsidies for electricity or gasoline. It's very difficult and certainly tremendously unpopular to turn off the tap. But it's not only aid that explains the electoral fiasco. There's an Argentine saying that the month actually has 20 days. 20 days when you have money, and another 10 when you don't.
On the other side, you have 70% of the population who are not making ends meet, who tell you that the month ends on the 20th, who tell you that they are living in a culture of no, there are no top brands, there are no rewards. Everything is effort, everyone has to work. There is moonlighting. I have to supplement my income with a few hours of Uber.
The sacrifice has also come in the form of wages that no longer rise at the same rate as inflation, in the form of more than 100,000 private jobs destroyed, as well as significant real cuts in pensions. And yes, obviously, there's also an ideological component. Let's not forget that the province of Buenos Aires is the #1 Peronist stronghold. It's traditionally their biggest source of votes, but even so, the defeat we're talking about tells us that something else is happening. And that is that controlling inflation is crucial, but it's not everything. It's not enough. And this has left Milei locked in a paradox that must be managed politically. Milei has made the adjustment that all previous governments avoided. The problem is that those most affected, the Argentines least prepared to withstand this wave of sacrifices, are the first to tire of waiting for results that aren't coming in an economy that has not yet finished revving up. Even less so when, it must be said, Milei and his entourage have shown very little empathy for people experiencing all these changes. And what makes me say this? Take the constant rock-star style trips abroad and the rising standard of living perceived in his inner circle. You can't flaunt success, fame, and glamour while a large proportion of Argentine society is suffering like never before from the initial effects of the cuts. To top it all off, recordings of suspected corruption have been the last straw, a total disaster. And that's not to mention Milei's inability to attract new supporters to the movement. Because if you only focus on polarizing and demonizing your opponent, particularly when you're already in government, you risk losing a huge number of votes. So, in summary, we have an economy that is still in a phase of adjustment, while a large part of the Argentine population is suffering intensely from the changes and losing patience. Meanwhile, they see a government that is living it up in its own bubble, aggressively attacking any dissidents, and, on top of that, affected by suspicions of corruption. No matter how you look at it, it's too much to handle. Even so, the economic factor may have been only the first stumbling block. Closely linked to what we've just told you is another factor that is no less important: the political factor. Almost everyone knew that Milei was not going to win in the province of Buenos Aires. The Peronist stronghold there is solid, but even in the best case scenario, polls predicted a result for Milei's party of around 40%. Well, the point is that with this in mind, the strategy of turning this election into a kind of referendum was too ambitious. In a way, we could say that the libertarians have fallen straight into the trap set by Peronism. And here is where we come to the other distinguishing feature of these elections, something that may have had more influence than it would appear at first glance. Axel Kicillof wanted these elections to be about him and his supporters, as opposed to Milei, which meant positioning himself as a kind of official successor to Kirchnerism, the new strong face of Peronism. And to that end, he made a perfectly planned political move.
Kicillof announced that he is separating the Buenos Aires election from the national election, thus redoubling his political challenge to Kirchnerism.
At the beginning of the year, Kicillof announced that the local elections would be held on a different date from the national elections, against the wishes of Cristina, Maximo Kirchner, and Sergio Massa. The outcome, it was the first time since 2003 that the Buenos Aires provincial elections were held on a different date from the national elections. But why do this, and what impact might it have had? Well, with this move, Kicillof and his Right to the Future movement have prepared their assault on the Peronist leadership. It also reduces the influence of Cristina, her son Maximo Kirchner, and La Campora when it comes to presenting candidates.
The election result emboldens Axel Kicillof's troops in the internal struggle with Cristina and Maximo Kirchner.
The governor of Buenos Aires has managed to turn these elections into a double victory. On the one hand, his and his circle's victory over Milei, Carina, Bullrich, and their supporters. And on the other hand, a victory against the most Kirchnerist wing of the party. Now, with this victory, Kicillof can present himself as the strongest alternative to Javier Milei, who he's already defeated in a way. In other words, Kicillof has managed to sweep the board in an election that was no longer just a regional election. Furthermore, by reducing Kirchner's influence, he also managed to improve his overall image and win back many votes along the way. It has been a brilliant move. Furthermore, in this election, Peronism has shown that it's still capable of uniting to pursue power. Cristina Kirchner, despite being weakened and confined to her home, accepted Kicillof's conditions and even tolerated Sergio Massa as an ally. All of this set the Peronist machine in the suburbs working at full capacity. Peronist mayors went out to hunt for votes as they had in their heyday, selling a new era. And it worked. And Milei, well, instead of expanding alliances, he clung to the idea of painting the country purple under the La Libertad Avanza brand. He fought with his vice president, offended moderate sectors of Macri's pro-party, shouted at passers-by from his campaign caravan, and ended up with a weak and fractured coalition, facing a fairly disciplined Peronism around the governor and the Fuerza Patria alliance. And guess what? In terms of communication, La Libertad Avanza has also failed to rise to the occasion. The Milei who won the hearts of millions in 2023 was a defiant outsider, willing to shout against the establishment and politicians, something that can work and did work. The problem is that when you're in power, things change a bit. Although he's moderated his tone, Milei continues to attack everything and everyone. Opponents, allies, former friends, and even neutral figures. It's basically his personal style. The problem arises when, through inexperience or clumsiness, you start to give your opponents a ready-made speech. Take, for example, the issue of Spagnuolo's audio recordings about alleged bribes in the purchase of medicines for the disabled, the Libra issue, or the much-discussed trips made by the president, especially to the United States, where he's already been 11 times. In total, we're talking about more than 20 trips abroad in a rockstar mode in just over a year and a half. Something that many Argentines see as excessive and a rather dubious use of government money. As we said before, austerity for those at the bottom and a sense of wastefulness for those at the top. And in the end, if you add up all the factors, you get this, a perfect blend of disillusionment and frustration. The point is that many are wondering, what now? Well, there's barely a month and a half left before the most important election for Milei, the national legislative elections, where the approval or rejection of all the reforms he has ahead of him will be decided. That will be the key to whether or not his government has the room for maneuver it needs. That's why last Monday's events are not just a simple parliamentary setback. They have consequences, several important ones, and if La Libertad Avanza wants to stand a real chance in October, it had better not ignore them. And that's exactly what we're going to look at next.
And now, what?
It seems the September 7th elections have shifted the pieces on the Argentine political chessboard, both for the government and for Peronism. Let's start with the governor of Buenos Aires himself, Axel Kicillof. As we said before, the first consequence is that this result puts Kicillof at the center of the political chessboard. He's suddenly become the strong contender against Javier Milei. In other words, the libertarian president is no longer up against a chaotic amalgam of Peronist and Kirchnerist figures fighting for power, but rather a figure with a clear name who's been reinforced electorally and who'll be able to rally support in the upcoming national elections.
Beyond the dancing on the balcony, Christina Kirchner had a bittersweet victory because Kicillof took the laurels.
For Christina and her son, the Buenos Aires election left a bittersweet taste. Yes, of course they celebrated. The Fuerza Patria coalition tasted victory again and showed that it still has muscle in the most decisive territory in the country. But at the same time, the feeling was strange because they'd just won an election they had never fully believed in and which had a strong personal component from the regional governor. To put it plainly, Peronism has a new leader and a new sense of strength. This will force Milei to make changes because what he's done so far is no longer enough. At the Gonnet bunker, Milei appeared alongside his sister Karina and Bullrich. The message acknowledged the blow and promised collections, but in the meantime, a shout was being heard from among the second and third lines of libertarians. There has to be a total change. In fact, the phrase most often repeated in the corridors and in libertarian chats was the risk of a split ticket. What does this mean? Basically, that voters are beginning to see the president as a project that is already outdated, exhausted, and doomed to rapid decline. And to avoid sinking completely, many are now calling for a radical change in government. Not just a cosmetic change in the cabinet, but a complete overhaul, which, of course, could also end up opening many Pandora's boxes. For instance, the campaign exposed many of the seams of the libertarian project, such as the internal conflict between Fuerzas del Cielo, Forces of Heaven, Santiago Caputo's faction, and Karina's Circle, which pushed its own vision by demanding loyalty to the president. The result, clashes that not only damaged the campaign, but also stability in Congress, and, as a knock-on effect, the perception of the economic direction. Now, what changes are most likely to occur following the heavy defeat? Although the Casa Rosada says that the course will not change, and that reforms will even be accelerated, behind closed doors there is speculation about several possibilities. First, a shake-up in the political cabinet, perhaps with the departure of weakened figures such as Franco's. Second, a possible change of role for Santiago Caputo. And third, an attempt to rebuild alliances, especially with disenchanted sectors of the pro-party who feel that Milei marginalized them from the Buenos Aires strategy. The question is whether Milei is willing to open up the game, or whether he will insist on governing with his inner circle. Above all, will he continue to leave so much freedom to act in the hands of his sister Karina? Because that's another thing. Karina was the other big loser of the night. She was the main architect of the libertarian strategy in the province of Buenos Aires. She had veto power over every candidate and did not hesitate to use it. For example, with the support of her chief advisor, Eduardo Lule Menem, she vetoed 4 of Patricia Bullrich's candidates for the lists, leaving her with little influence in the province. So now, many eyes are looking directly at her, at Karina. Argentina's difficult situation requires confidence and stability in reforms, and an electoral defeat for the president's party by a margin of almost 14 points does not exactly help in that regard. Right now, the executive fears a further decline in the value of the peso, which could make it difficult to control inflation, or even an increase in country risk, which even before the elections exceeded 900 basis points, its highest level in 5 months. And remember that this indicator is key to determining market confidence in Argentine debt, and that the higher the country risk, the more difficult it is to finance, and the less capital is usually available. The result, market changes induced by a government that is seen as exhausted may slow down the changes and increase the pain of the adjustment. In other words, there is a risk of entering a vicious spiral from which it may be difficult to escape. That's why the government will have to maneuver at full speed to avoid appearing wiped out. There will have to be changes in the cabinet. They will have to make it clear who's in charge of the party and with what internal leadership it will present itself at the end of October for the legislative elections. All of this will be crucial for Milei to save face, because let's be clear about one thing. Peronism is going to exploit this victory to the point of exhaustion. Running in an election with a victory under your belt from the previous month is not the same as running with a major defeat. The psychological effect on voters can be decisive. Without a doubt, we at VisualPolitik will be following everything that happens in the month and a half remaining until the big election that will define the future of Milei's project. But until then, the questions are for you. Do you think this defeat has national implications, or does it only affect the province of Buenos Aires? Do you think Kicillof will achieve greater control over Peronism? Will Milei make it safely to next month's legislative elections? Well, leave your comments below and let's see what the VisualPolitik community has to say about all this. And once again, a big thank you to CyberGhost for sponsoring this video. For just $2.03 a month, you get full protection for your data and unrestricted access to blocked content around the world. Remember, you can try it completely risk-free thanks to their 45-day money-back guarantee, and by signing up, you're also helping support our content. Click the link in the description below. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it, and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. It's free, and it helps us out a lot. As always, thank you so very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.